Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 9, Episode 17. Today, we're delving into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History to explore the life and legacy of Joseph Stalin. Quite a figure.
Absolutely. One of history's most, enigmatic and brutal leaders. Lowe's work gives us a really solid framework.
It does. We're drawing directly from his chapters on Stalin, and our mission really is to unpack how Joseph Jugashvili, born to poor peasants in Georgia,
Right.
rose to become the man of steel, the
Yeah.
supreme leader of the Soviet Union. We want to look at the huge changes he brought about, but also, critically, the immense human cost.
Yeah, it's a journey into understanding someone who, some contemporaries called him a mediocre administrator.
Yeah, I read that Trotsky, wasn't it?
Trotsky, Sukhanov. Yet he completely reshaped a nation, impacted global history. The outcomes were, you could say, successful in some very specific strategic ways. But also just unequivocally terrible in human terms.
Absolutely. So we're not just reciting facts here. We'll dig into surprising details, maybe some conflicting historical takes.
For sure.
And try to get a sense of not just what happened, but why it mattered so much to the ordinary people living through it all.
Okay.
So let's start with that ascent. How does this man, described as the party's most eminent mediocrity, a vague great blur, even Lenin suggested removing him.
Oh.
How does he become the absolute dictator? It seems, improbable.
It really does. So Joseph Jugashvili, he took the name Stalin, Man of Steel, around 1904, was born in Gori, Georgia, 1879. Humble beginnings. Poor peasants.
Right.
He actually trained for the priesthood initially, but got expelled for spreading socialist ideas. Fast forward past 1917, and his real talent emerged, administration. He had an outstanding ability as an administrator.
Okay.
This allowed him to quietly build his position under Lenin. By the time Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was already the party's secretary general and a member of the Politburo, the top decision-making body.
Okay, so Lenin's death in 24 is the flashpoint. This is where the personalities and rivalries really kick in, right? Who are the main contenders?
Well, the most obvious successor you'd think was Leon Trotsky.
The orator, the Red Army guy.
Exactly. Inspired orator, intellectual, man of action. Then you had the old Bolsheviks, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev. He headed the Leningrad Party and the Comintern.
Promoting world revolution.
Right. And Nikolai Bukharin, the party's sort of chief theorist, each had serious credentials. But Stalin, he cleverly exploited their weaknesses.
How so?
Trotsky's brilliance came with arrogance. He rubbed the other Politburo members the wrong way. They saw him as condescending and, they kind of resented that he'd only joined the Bolsheviks late in 1917.
Oh, okay, so they ganged up on him.
Pretty much. They actively worked to stop him becoming leader. By the end of 1924, Trotsky's support base had just melted away.
And the others just missed the threat from Stalin.
They totally underestimated him, saw him as just a competent administrator, the backroom guy. They even ignored Lenin's explicit warning, his testament suggesting Stalin should be removed as Secretary General.
A huge mistake in hindsight.
Massive. Because Stalin had real political skill. Lowe says he could cut through the complexities of a problem and focus on the essentials. And he was an excellent judge of character, sensing weaknesses and exploiting them.
So what was his strategy? Just wait them out.
His strategy was brilliant in a ruthless way. Wait for disagreements, then skillfully side with one faction against another, pick them off one by one.
So he was building his power base while they were fighting each other.
Exactly. And his ace card was that position, Secretary General, held since 1922. It gave him the power to appoint and promote officials.
The patronage system.
Precisely. He quietly filled key party posts across the country with his own supporters, Stalinites. He'd remove opponents, sending them off to remote regions. So when local parties chose delegates for the National Party conferences...
They were packed with his people.
Packed, which meant the Central Committee elected by the conference was packed, which meant the Politburo, chosen by the Central Committee, became dominated by his supporters. By 1928, Lowe says he was simply unassailable.
Wow. And did he use ideology debates too, or was it purely power politics?
Oh, the ideological debates were crucial. Marx hadn't left a detailed blueprint, right? So there were genuine disagreements. The big one was between Bukharin's socialism in one country.
Which was?
Basically, consolidate Soviet power first, build it up based on a prosperous peasantry, gradual industrialization, focus inward.
Okay.
Versus Trotsky's permanent revolution. He argued the USSR couldn't industrialize alone. It needed revolutions outside Russia to help.
And Stalin played this out.
Initially, he seemed neutral. Then he backed Bukharin, the socialism in one country idea to isolate Trotsky. Then a split happened between Bukharin and Kamenev-Zinoviev over the NEP, the new economic policy.
That policy allowed some private enterprise, created the richer peasants, the kulaks.
Exactly. Kamenev and Zinoviev wanted to ditch NEP faster. Stalin again sided with Bukharin. But once Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev were dealt with, expelled from the party by 1927.
He turned on Bukharin.
Precisely. Suddenly, Stalin abandoned NEP himself. He claimed the kulaks were holding back progress. Bukharin was shocked, outmaneuvered, voted off the Politburo in 1929. Stalin was supreme.
Was it just cynical maneuvering? Or did he believe his own arguments?
Critics definitely saw it as cynical. But, as Robert Service points out, many party members genuinely did believe the kulaks were blocking progress. So Stalin's policy shift actually resonated with quite a few of them.
Right, so power consolidated. Now the economy. Russia's a huge, largely agricultural country.
Right.
What challenges did he face?
Immense challenges. In 1929, heavy industry, coal, steel, iron was way behind the West. France, let alone Germany, Britain, the U.S. Stalin was convinced they needed rapid industrialization, for defense primarily. He feared attack from capitalist countries.
And to strengthen the communist base.
Exactly. More industrial workers meant more support for the regime. But the big problem was capital. Foreigners weren't exactly lining up to invest in communist Russia.
And agriculture.
Agriculture was also in a dire state. Needed to produce way more food for the growing cities, and crucially for export. Exports were the only way to get foreign currency to buy industrial machinery.
Right.
But the system under NEP, with millions of tiny peasant farms, was just too inefficient. Food shortages were hitting the cities by 1928. There was a real danger of famine. Drastic action felt necessary.
And Stalin, despite having zero economic experience, just dives in. He makes that famous declaration, we are 50 or 100 years behind. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed.
Mm-hmm.
So the 5-year plans, what were they and did they actually work?
He was utterly determined. The first two plans, running roughly 1928 to 1937, were laser-focused on heavy industry. Coal, iron, steel, oil, machinery, tractors. Forget consumer goods for now.
And the results?
Well, the official line was they were completed ahead of schedule, though targets weren't always fully met. But the overall achievement was, frankly, remarkable. By 1940, the USSR had overtaken Britain in iron and steel and was catching up to Germany.
That's incredible speed.
It was. And strategically vital, hundreds of new factories were built east of the Ural Mountains, safe from invasion. This proved absolutely crucial when Germany invaded in 1941.
How did they fund it all internally?
Through grain exports, squeezing the peasantry charges on the peasants, and plowing back any profits from state industries. They hired foreign technicians, massively expanded education to create skilled workers. And, ironically,
Yes.
they used capitalist methods, piecework rates, pay differentials to reward productive workers. The whole Stakhanovite movement started named after Alexei Stakhanov, a miner who supposedly cut 102 tons of coal in one shift.
Wow. But there must have been a dark side to this incredible push.
Oh, absolutely. A very dark side. Workers faced ruthless discipline, severe punishments for minor errors. If targets weren't met, managers or workers could be accused of being saboteurs or wreckers.
And sent where?
To forced labor camps.
Yeah.
The gulag system was expanding rapidly. Housing conditions were often appalling. Basic consumer goods almost non-existent because everything went into heavy industry.
So people were sacrificing enormously.
Hugely. Richard Freeborn called the first 5-year plan a declaration of war against the workers and peasants, subjected to greater exploitation than any they had known under capitalism. Product quality was often poor, too.
Were there any improvements for ordinary people during this time?
By the mid-1930s, maybe some small signs. Medical care expanded, education became more accessible, but overall it was incredibly tough. Historians like Macaulay acknowledge there was some genuine enthusiasm among workers, too, alongside the coercion. Alec Nove agrees a great industry was built, but the methods were unnecessarily brutal.
Okay, so that's industry. What about agriculture? The other side of the coin was collectivization. What was the thinking there?
Two main goals. First, efficiency. Merge millions of small, inefficient peasant plots into large, state-controlled collective farms, kolkhozes. Use modern machinery, tractors, boost grain output for the cities and for export.
And the second goal?
Political. To eliminate the class of prosperous peasants, kulaks. Stalin saw them as capitalists, enemies of communism. He was blunt. We must smash the kulaks so hard that they will never rise to their feet again.
How did this play out in reality? Was it voluntary?
Voluntary, not a chance. It was carried out by sheer brute force, as Lowe puts it. Peasants fiercely resisted giving up their land and animals, not just the kulaks, but ordinary peasants too.
What did they do?
Many slaughtered their livestock and burned their crops rather than hand them over to the collective. The state responded brutally. Peasants who refused to join were labeled kulaks or kulak helpers, arrested, deported to Siberia, sent to labor camps, or just shot.
So did collectivization actually boost production?
That's the tragic irony. By 1937, over 90% of farmland was collectivized, but total grain production, it barely increased. In some years, like 1934, it was less than in 1928, before collectivization started. Livestock numbers plummeted.
Why did it fail so badly?
Several reasons. Removing the kulaks meant removing the most productive farmers. The party activists sent to enforce it often knew nothing about agriculture. Peasants were demoralized, worked poorly on collective land, focusing instead on the tiny private plots they were eventually allowed. And there weren't enough tractors initially.
And the human cost?
Catastrophic. It led directly to a horrific famine, mainly in the countryside, between 1932 and 1933. Especially severe in Ukraine, the Holodomor. Estimates suggest over 5 million peasants died of starvation.
5 million.
And during this time, the state was still exporting grain 1.75 million tons in 1932. Some historians argue Stalin actually welcomed the famine.
Welcomed it. Why?
Because it, along with deporting or killing around 10 million alleged kulaks, finally broke the peasants' resistance. It cemented state control over the countryside and the grain supply. A brutal outcome.
Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. Let's shift to politics. Beyond the economy, Stalin was tightening his grip through, well, terror, what led to the infamous purges and the Great Terror.
By the mid-1930s, despite his dictatorship, Stalin felt increasingly insecure. Paranoid, perhaps, he saw plots everywhere. Government popularity was low because of the hardships of collectivization and the five-year plans.
Was there actual opposition within the party?
Yes, there was growing discontent. A key example was the Ryutin Platform, a document circulated secretly by some party members, including Martymyan Ryutin, that criticized Stalin's policies and actually called for his removal.
That must have spooked Stalin.
Deeply. Plus, there were nationalist sentiments stirring in some non-Russian republics. Stalin was determined to crush any hint of opposition or separatism.
So, how did the purges start?
Initially, it was about cleansing the party. Between 1933 and 1934, over 1 million members, nearly a third, were expelled for being passive or critical. Millions were already in prisons or labor camps. But at first, it wasn't systematic executions of top leaders.
What changed? What triggered the Great Terror?
The assassination of Sergei Kirov, the popular Leningrad party boss, in December 1934, that was the turning point. Stalin immediately used it as a pretext to launch wider, much harsher purges.
Was Stalin involved in Kirov's murder?
It's widely suspected, yes. Many historians, like Robert Conquest, believe Stalin likely orchestrated it. Conquest called it the crime of the century, the keystone of the entire edifice of terror. Kirov was becoming too popular, perhaps a rival.
So Kirov's death unleashed the floodgates.
Absolutely. From 1936 to 1938, the purges escalated into the Great Terror. Lowe estimates well over 3 million people were executed or died in the camps in just those 2 years alone. It's staggering.
3 million. Who were they targeting?
It started at the top. Hundreds of high-ranking officials, the old Bolsheviks who had known Lenin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Ryutin, were arrested. They were subjected to brutal torture, forced to confess to absurd crimes.
Like plotting with Trotsky or
What?
foreign powers.
Exactly. Then they were paraded in public show trials, found guilty, and executed. But it didn't stop there. The terror spread downwards. A massive purge hit the Red Army leadership.
The military. Why?
Fear of a coup, perhaps. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the brilliant commander-in-chief, and about 2/3 of the army's top officers were executed. It massively weakened the army right before World War II.
Madness. And ordinary people.
Millions of ordinary, innocent people were swept up too, denounced by neighbors, colleagues, sometimes for no reason at all. Estimates range from 5 to 8 million people ended up in the Gulag system by the late 1930s. Even Trotsky, exiled in Mexico, wasn't safe. Stalin sent an assassin who killed him in 1940.
It's just incomprehensible cruelty. Why? What was the point of such self-destructive terror? How do historians explain it?
That's the million-dollar question. The traditional view emphasizes Stalin's paranoia, his immense lust for power, and a calculated policy of terror. Frighten everyone into obedience by arresting and shooting a certain percentage, guilty or not. Create total fear.
Are there other interpretations?
Yes, revisionist historians like J.R. Getty argued it wasn't just Stalin. They saw it more as chaotic infighting, driven by the obsessive fears of the entire ruling elite, maybe spiraling out of control. Sheila Fitzpatrick talked about it as a kind of continuing revolution, an extreme response to perceived threats and conspiracies.
What does the more recent evidence suggest from the Soviet archives?
Evidence uncovered after the Soviet collapse by historians like Dmitry Volkogonov tends to support the traditional view more. It shows Stalin personally signing death warrants, approving execution lists for thousands. He seemed to have an evil mind, lacking any moral compass. He later scapegoated Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD secret police, for the excesses, but the orders came from the top.
What were the immediate results of the purges, besides the deaths?
Well, they eliminated any potential rivals or alternative leaders. They absolutely terrorized the population into submission. And they completely subjugated all state structures, the party, the government, the military, the economy, to Stalin's personal will, but at a terrible cost to efficiency and morale.
Okay, now amidst all this terror, something seemingly contradictory happens. A new constitution in 1936. What was that about?
Yeah, it's quite jarring, isn't it? The 1936 Constitution, on paper, looked incredibly democratic. It declared the USSR a socialist state of workers and peasants. Everyone got the vote, that secret ballot, for the Supreme Soviet. It even mentioned rights like freedom of speech, thought, press.
Sounds good. Just good to be true.
Entirely. It was pure facade, window dressing for the outside world, perhaps. Elections weren't competitive. Only one Communist Party candidate stood in each constituency. Real power stayed firmly with the Politburo, meaning Stalin. Any dissent. Quickly purged, nobody inside the USSR took the democratic claim seriously.
Right. Now, Stalin himself wasn't Russian. He was Georgian. The Soviet Union was this vast, multi-ethnic empire. How did he keep it all together?
He used what Lowe calls a two-handed approach. On one hand, quite cleverly, he allowed and even encouraged distinct national cultures and languages. Each republic had its own identity to some extent. This was actually more liberal than the old czarist policy of Russianization.
But the other hand?
The other hand held the iron fist. Moscow always had the final say on anything important. If any republic or nationality stepped out of line or showed too much independence, the response was ruthless.
Any examples?
Sure. When the Ukrainian Communist Party leadership admitted collectivization had failed there in 1932, Moscow purged them for bourgeois nationalist deviationism. Much later, in 1951, when some Georgian communist leaders apparently tried to break away, Stalin had them removed and shot. Cultural autonomy, yes. Political autonomy, absolutely not.
Okay, let's shift focus now from the high politics and terror down to the ground level. What was daily life actually like for ordinary Soviet citizens under Stalin, especially in the 1930s?
In a word, hard. Extremely hard, especially in the early 30s. The state was everywhere, involved in every aspect of life. And the shortages, constant shortages of basic food and consumer goods because of the five-year plan's focus on heavy industry and, of course, the famine.
Can you give us a sense of the scale?
Yeah, Lowe cites figures. A Moscow worker in 1933 was consuming less than half the bread and flour they would have in 1900 under the Tsar. By 1937, average real wages were still only about 3/5 of what they'd been in 1928 before the big push. And housing was a massive problem, too. Cities grew incredibly fast. The urban population jumped by 31 million between 1926 and 1939.
Where did they all live?
Often in horrific conditions. Homes were subdivided into communal apartments or kommunalkas, with multiple families sharing kitchens and bathrooms. People lived in corridors, under staircases. Many workers were housed in basic barracks. Moscow got a bit more attention, but generally urban living standards were grim.
You mentioned earlier the elite groups.
Yeah.
The nomenklatura, the Stakhanovites. What privileges did they have? This must have caused resentment.
Huge resentment. Party members, government officials, the intelligentsia, engineers, those Stakhanovite superworkers, they got special treatment. Things like home delivery of bread, access to special shops with lower prices and more goods, better apartments, sometimes dachas country houses.
Creating a them and us situation.
Absolutely. It fostered a deep sense of grievance among ordinary people. The revolution promised equality, but here was a new privileged class emerging, living much better lives while everyone else struggled.
Yet Stalin himself declared in 1935, life has become better. Life has become more joyous. Was that just propaganda, or were there any improvements people could see?
It wasn't all bleak, especially by the later 1930s. Food supplies did gradually improve after the famine, and rationing was finally abolished in 1936. Factory canteens provided cheap meals, Education, as we mentioned, was free and expanding, so was basic health care. The state also pushed this idea of state paternalism acting like a protective father, providing leisure facilities, cinemas, sports stadiums, public parks like Gorky Park in Moscow, designed for wholesome recreation.
And this idea of culturedness. Culture.
Right. That was a big campaign. Encouraging people to adopt cultured habits, personal hygiene, polite behavior, speaking and thinking in approved Bolshevik ways. Even shopping was supposed to become more cultured, with new state bread shops aiming for cleanliness and politeness, trying to mold the new Soviet citizen.
What about women and families during this period? It must have been incredibly tough.
Incredibly, with so many men disappearing through collectivization, famine, purges, arrests, millions of women became the sole breadwinners for their families. Desertion rates, divorce rates were high.
But women were also needed in the workforce, right?
Desperately needed. Over 10 million women joined the workforce for the first time during the 1930s. By 1940, they made up nearly 40% of the paid workforce, doing all sorts of jobs, even heavy industry, traditionally male roles.
So the state needed them working, but also wanted stable families. How did they square that circle?
It was a real dilemma. They tried to provide more support, like doubling the number of daycare centers, but they also reversed earlier Bolshevik policies that made divorce easy and abortion legal. New laws in 1936 made abortion illegal again, offered financial incentives for having more children, increased maternity benefits.
Putting a huge double burden on women.
Exactly. Work all day, often in tough conditions, raise children, manage the household with shortages. It was exhausting. There was also a wives' movement for the wives of elite men, promoting culturedness at home and preparing women for potential wartime roles.
Okay, let's look at culture more broadly. Education, religion, the arts. How did the state control these?
Education, as we said, was a major achievement in terms of access and literacy. Free mass education was rolled out. Literacy rates shot up dramatically, near 94% in towns, 86% in rural areas by 1939. A huge change from Tsarist times.
But with an agenda.
Of course. The ulterior motive, as Lowe says, was indoctrination, turning the younger generation into loyal, good, orthodox Soviet citizens. Ironically, teaching methods actually became more traditional and disciplined again, moving away from earlier revolutionary experiments.
And religion. The Bolsheviks were atheists.
Militantly so. Lenin had already launched attacks on the Orthodox Church. Under Stalin, it got much worse. Secret instructions went out to attack churches and priests. Thousands were killed or sent to camps. Most churches and mosques were closed down or repurposed.
Why such aggression?
Communism was meant to be the only belief system. Religion was a rival ideology. By 1941, maybe only 1 in 40 church buildings was still functioning as such. There was a brief thaw during World War II when Stalin needed the church to rally patriotism, but the underlying hostility remained.
What about literature and theater?
They went through a so-called cultural revolution from about 1928 to 1931. The key doctrine imposed was socialist realism. Art and literature had to glorify the Soviet achievement, depict happy workers, wise leaders, the bright communist future. It had to be optimistic, heroic, and easily understood by the masses.
Realistic, but not too realistic.
Exactly. An idealized realism. Stalin took personal control. He disbanded various writers' groups and set up the Single Union of Soviet Writers. If you wanted to be published, you towed the party line. Many works became propaganda pieces, like the 5-year plan novels.
What happened to writers or artists who didn't conform?
It was incredibly dangerous. Many great talents were silenced. The poet Osip Mandelstam wrote a critical poem about Stalin, was arrested, tortured, died in a transit camp. The brilliant experimental theater director Vsevolod Meyerhold refused to renounce his style, was arrested, tortured, and shot in 1940. His wife was murdered, too. Their works were banned. Ironically, the regime later brought back 19th century Russian classics Pushkin, Tolstoy as safe, patriotic alternatives.
And other arts. Music, painting.
Same story. Socialist realism ruled. Abstract art was condemned as bourgeois formalism. Paintings had to be photographic, detailed depictions of workers, collective farmers, revolutionary scenes, portraits of leaders. In music, Western modernism composers like Schoenberg was denounced. Dmitri Shostakovich is a famous case. He was a rising star, but his opera, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, personally offended Stalin in 1936. An article appeared in Pravda, likely dictated by Stalin, calling it muddle instead of music.
Terrifying for Shostakovich.
Absolutely terrifying. He feared arrest, he survived, but had to publicly repent and compose more accessible, often patriotic music, like his Fifth Symphony, subtitled A Soviet Artist's Response to Just Criticism. It shows how Stalin's personal taste could dictate artistic policy.
Even cinema. Stalin saw that as important, didn't he?
Hugely important. He called it the most important form of communication. Films had to be intelligible to the millions, rooted in socialist realism. Filmmakers were under immense pressure. The head of the film industry, Boris Shumyatsky, was arrested and shot during the purges. Sergei Eisenstein, the genius director of Battleship Potemkin, fell out of favor, but managed to redeem himself with the patriotic epic Alexander Nevsky in 1938.
Which had a contemporary message.
Definitely. It was about a medieval Russian prince defeating German invaders, a very clear warning directed at Nazi Germany. Cinema became a key tool for propaganda and shaping public opinion.
Okay, let's move towards the end. World War II happens. The USSR suffers unimaginable losses, but emerges victorious. Did life get any easier for the Soviet people in Stalin's final years after 1945?
You'd think so, after such sacrifice. But no, the war cost the USSR maybe 25 million lives, left 25 million homeless, devastated the western regions. Yet Stalin saw the victory not as a reason to relax, but as the ultimate vindication of his entire system of government.
So, no loosening of the reins.
Quite the opposite. Stalin feared that contact with the West during the war might have contaminated people. He launched what Lowe calls the last battles. Nationalist movements in newly acquired territories like the Baltics were brutally crushed, hundreds of thousands deported. The Gulag population actually doubled after the war, reaching about 2.5 million by the early 1950s.
Doubled. Where did all these new prisoners come from?
Many were Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans. Stalin viewed them as traitors or, at best, politically unreliable for having surrendered or seen life outside. Around 2.8 million returning prisoners of war were arrested, many sent straight to the Gulag. Another 3 million Soviet citizens who had been forced laborers in Germany or had simply seen life in Allied-occupied zones were also considered tainted, and many ended up in the camps. It provided a huge pool of slave labor for reconstruction.
Just horrific. What about the economy after the war? And did the purges continue?
There was a fourth five-year plan, 1946-50. Industrially, it was declared a success. Production supposedly reached pre-war levels. And its big achievement was the Soviet Union exploding its first atomic bomb in August 1949, much earlier than the West expected. But agriculture remained the great failure. The 1946 harvest was catastrophic, leading to another famine in some regions, maybe 1 million deaths, even reports of cannibalism. By 1952, grain production was still lower than in 1940. Alec Lowe famously asked, how could it be tolerated that a country capable of making an atomic bomb could not supply its citizens with eggs?
And the purges.
They didn't stop. Control over intellectual life was tightened again, led by Andrei Zhdanov. Writers like Anna Akhmatova were expelled from the Writers' Union. Composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev were publicly disgraced again. This culminated in the sinister doctors' plot in late 1952.
What was that?
A group of prominent doctors, mostly Jewish, were accused of plotting to murder top Soviet leaders. It was fueled by anti-Semitism and widely seen as the prelude to another massive purge, perhaps targeting figures like Beria, head of the secret police. But then, Stalin died suddenly in March 1953 before it could fully unfold.
His death stopped it.
It seems so. The plot was quickly denounced as a fabrication after his death.
So how do we even begin to sum up this figure, Stalin? The assessments must be wildly divergent.
Absolutely. It's incredibly complex. On the one hand, some historians try to find, well, not justifications, but explanations or even some positives. Sheila Fitzpatrick talks about the USSR under Stalin being, at its most dynamic, a period of huge social and economic experimentation.
Right.
Macaulay and Nova argue that Russia faced such a desperate situation after the revolution that maybe extraordinary methods were needed to modernize and industrialize quickly.
And the war argument.
That's often seen as the supreme justification, that his brutal methods, forcing industrialization, made the USSR strong enough to ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. Jeffrey Roberts argues that without Stalin's leadership and the industrial base he built, Russia would probably have lost the war.
Was he genuinely popular?
It seems he was with certain groups. The new elite, the nomenklatura, certainly owed their positions and privileges to him. And perhaps surprisingly, evidence suggests he retained considerable popularity among ordinary people, too. He was incredibly skilled at propaganda, at manipulating public opinion, always shifting blame for failures onto lower officials or enemies.
Okay, but the counterarguments must be overwhelming.
They are. Collectivization was an unmitigated disaster, economically and humanly. Industrial success was real, but focused narrowly on heavy industry, crushing living standards and consumer goods. Many argue less brutal, more conventional methods could have achieved similar or even better industrial progress over time without the horrific cost.
And the claim he won the war.
Highly contested. Critics point out his blunders almost lost the war early on. Purging the Red Army leadership, ignoring clear warnings about the German invasion in 1941, interfering with military commanders. These were catastrophic mistakes. Russia won, arguably, despite some of Stalin's actions, thanks to the vastness of the country, the climate, Allied aid, and the incredible sacrifice of the Soviet people.
And then there's the death toll.
Yes. The sheer scale of death attributable directly to his policies is staggering. Beyond the tens of millions who died in the war, estimates suggest maybe another 20 million deaths resulted from collectivization, the resulting famine, the purges, and the Great Terror, the Gulag system, and the forced deportations of entire nationalities during and after the war.
20 million.
It's a number so large it's hard to comprehend. And we have to remember, it wasn't just Stalin acting alone. Many people were willing participants in the terror, carrying out orders, denouncing neighbors. There were countless little Stalins running local terrors.
What about his state of mind? Was he paranoid, evil?
Interpretations vary. Khrushchev, in his secret speech, portrayed him as sickly suspicious, essentially paranoid. Roy Medvedev saw him as perfectly sane but coolly ruthless, one of the greatest criminals in human history. Revisionists like Arch Getty suggested the terror wasn't just down to Stalin's psychology, but emerged from the collective anxieties of the ruling elite.
Okay, the final big question historians grapple with. Was Stalinism just Leninism taken to its logical conclusion? Or was it a betrayal of Lenin's revolution?
A huge debate. Arguments for continuity point to the violence inherent in the Bolshevik seizure of power itself. Some Russian historians, like Alexander Yakovlev, who oversaw Glasnost archives, condemned both leaders, saying Stalin simply carried on from Lenin. Volkogonov also stressed the violence shared by both. Stalin himself always claimed he was merely developing Lenin's ideas, like the NEP leading naturally to collectivization.
But what are the arguments for a distinct break? That Stalinism was different from Leninism?
Many historians argue there was a fundamental break. Irina Pavlova argued that only under Stalin did the party bureaucracy completely fuse with the state and become all-powerful, unaccountable. Stalin was undeniably much more of a dictator than Lenin ever was, ruling personally in a way Lenin didn't.
Even though Lenin used violence too.
Yes, Lenin used terror, especially during the Civil War, but some argue it was arguably out of perceived necessity for survival. Stalin's terror in the 1930s occurred when the regime was relatively secure. Alternatives seemed possible. Robert Tucker and Trotsky argued Stalinism wasn't rooted in Lenin's ideas, but in Russia's backward political culture. They saw Lenin's party as potentially more democratic.
Could things have gone differently?
Some argue yes. If a different leader, like Bukharin, had won the power struggle, Soviet history might have taken a different path, perhaps focusing on gradualism, winning over the peasants, avoiding the worst of the terror. They argue that rule by one man was anti-Leninist.
So the betrayal argument.
The core of that argument is that Stalin hijacked the revolution. He betrayed the original socialist ideals of Marx and Lenin, replacing the vision of a classless society with a new system of exploitation, ruled by a privileged party elite, maintained by unprecedented levels of terror. Martin Macaulay probably sums it up best in a balanced but stark way. He concludes, whether one approves or disapproves of it, it was a truly remarkable phenomenon, one that profoundly marked the 20th century. One can only approve of it if one suspends moral judgment.
Suspending moral judgment. Difficult to do with this subject. Thank you for joining us on this really intense deep dive into the world of Joseph Stalin's Russia through the lens of Norman Lowe's work.
It really is a stark reminder, isn't it, how completely the state can permeate every corner of life, and it leaves you asking how such a system could even come about and persist for so long at such a terrible cost.
It really does. And maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. How much of a leader's brutal effectiveness, if you can even call it, that comes down to their own personal psychology, their pathology? And how much is about the circumstances, the history, and crucially, the willingness of so many others to follow, to carry out the orders, no matter how horrific? It makes you wonder if a regime like that is ever truly over, while the potential for such control and terror still exists.